I'm Pete Mandick. I'm Associate Professor of Philosophy at William Patterson University. This is my talk, Color Consciousness Conceptualism. In this talk, I'm going to be defending conceptualism. As I'll understand conceptualism, it's the view that the contents of conscious experience are no more fine-grained than can be accounted for by the non-demonstrative concepts that a perceiver is able to bring to bear in experience. In this talk, I'm going to be defending conceptualism against a certain line of attack that I'm going to call the diachronic indistinguishability argument. Central to the diachronic indistinguishability argument is the existence of certain color pairs that are so similar they cannot be discriminated if presented across a memory delay. That is, they are too similar to be discriminated if presented one at a time. But they are sufficiently distinct that they can be discriminated if presented simultaneously. The organization of the remainder of the talk is as follows. First, I want to lay out some further preliminaries and relevant historical background. Then I'll present the diachronic indistinguishability argument and my main criticisms of it. After that, I'll consider some objections and offer replies. And finally, I will summarize the main explanatory strategies available to the conceptualist in accounting for these failures of diachronic discrimination. I'd like to here make three additional preliminary remarks. The first is to clarify that I'm only interested in, for the purposes of this talk, conscious experiences. I'm defending conceptualism about conscious experiences. Now, I want to be open to the possibility that I find to be quite plausible that there is such a thing as non-conceptual content, and that such non-conceptual contents are to be found in non-conscious, subpersonal mental states. But the present talk isn't about non-conscious mental states. I'm here only focusing on conscious mental states, and will be defending conceptualism about those mental states. The second point I want to spell out, just to be clear, is that I'm not here to give positive considerations in favor of conceptualism, but instead to defend conceptualism against a specific line of attack. I'm not offering positive considerations for conceptualism, but I do address that elsewhere. And I'm not the only one. Positive considerations for this version of conceptualism can be found in a relatively famous source in David Rosenthal's various expositions of his higher order thought theory of consciousness. For a less famous example, my own, I defend conceptualism in my paper, An Epistemological Theory of Consciousness. Now, even though there's this overlap of conceptualism in the theory of consciousness that I advocate and the one that Rosenthal argues for, I want to be clear that I'm not specifically a fan of the higher order thought theory of consciousness, and I have leveled criticism against it in my paper, Beware of the Unicorn. But I do like the conceptualism part of the higher order thought theory of consciousness. And there are many parallels between my views of the conceptual contents of conscious experience and Rosenthal's. Finally, I want to spell out that while in the present talk I'm really just going to be focusing on color experience, I do anticipate that these remarks will generalize to other sensory modalities besides vision, and other aspects of vision besides color perception. Nonetheless, all the examples in discussion are going to be specifically about the visual perception of colors. I now want to turn to some brief historical remarks. There's an oft-discussed line of thought concerning non-conceptual content that can be attributed to Gareth Evans. The thought boils down to the assertion that we experience more colors than we have concepts for. Now, Gareth Evans' point can be granted as a plausible one if we're focusing just on non-comparative color concepts, concepts such as red or vermilion. It's very plausible that we experience more colors than we have those sorts of concepts. However, there are other sorts of concepts that conceptualists can appeal to try to circumvent Evans' point. One widely discussed line of resistance against Evans' point is a strategy due to John McDowell that appeals to demonstrative concepts of color. Concepts like this color or that shade. Unlike McDowell, I will not be relying on demonstrative concepts to defend conceptualism. I think that a case for conceptualism can be made without any essential appeal to demonstrative concepts. I will, however, be helping myself to, in addition to non-comparative color concepts, comparative color concepts. Examples of comparative color concepts are concepts such as darker shade than or a redder shade than. I mentioned the demonstrative strategy because it's famous, and I want to be clear that I'm offering a different strategy. I take it to be relatively obvious that Evans' point can be resisted in terms of comparative and non-comparative color concepts. So for any pair of colors that I'm able to discriminate, I could discriminate them as one being a darker shade of blue than the other. I take it to be relatively obvious that Evans' argument is going to be relatively ineffectual against the conceptualist. And so a stronger argument is going to be needed. And it's to such a stronger argument that I now turn. Here's an example of a pair of colors that can be discriminated if they're presented simultaneously. Many will be able to see that the color on the left is darker than the color on the right. However, these colors are too similar to be distinguished if they're presented across a memory delay. In her article, The Persistence of Phenomenology, Diana Raffman makes use of such color pairs to construct an argument against conceptualism. The argument proceeds by making certain assumptions, which I'm prepared to grant, concerning the connection between concepts and memory. Plausibly, concepts are a kind of memory structure. And so the color pairs that are diachronically indistinguishable, but synchronically distinguishable, seem to be the basis for a plausible case against conceptualism for the following reasons. Since the colors are synchronically distinguishable, this seems to indicate that the colors have correlative contents in consciousness. Their being distinguished seems to indicate that they are somehow getting into consciousness. And the fact that they can't be distinguished across a memory delay, when paired with certain assumptions relating concepts to memory, seems to indicate that these conscious contents outstrip our conceptual repertoire. Despite this plausibility, however, I think that the argument is deeply flawed. My main complaint about the argument is that it seems to make an unwarranted assumption that whenever a color is presented to a subject, the corresponding conscious content will always be the same. So the idea might be put this way. Regardless of whether the color is presented in the synchronic context or the diachronic context, as long as lighting conditions are held constant, the color is always going to give rise to the same conscious content. We might put the assumption in terms of qualia. So we've got colors 1 and color 2, and they give rise to quale 1 and quale 2. And quale 1 and quale 2 appear at the same time, in the synchronic condition, and the very same qualia, quale 1 and quale 2, appear in the diachronic condition. They just appear one after the other. So that's the assumption that I want to question about the argument. I think there are empirical grounds for questioning such an assumption. The empirical considerations that I have in mind are the relatively well-known effects that context can have on color perception. For an especially potent example of the effects that context can have on perceived color, consider this illustration. When we impose a white mask onto these cubes, we see regions on the top of both cubes that appear gray. When we remove the white mask, the previously gray regions on the left cube seem to be blue, and the gray regions that were previously seen on the right cube seem to be yellow. The blue regions on the left and the yellow regions on the right seem to be gray when we put the white mask back on. And this is a potent illustration of context effects on perceived color. I think it's open to the conceptualist to say that the different presentations of the color chips, the diachronic and the synchronic presentations, are different contexts which give rise to different perceptions of the colors of the chips thereby presented. So the conceptualist can model what's going on in the following way. In the synchronic case, the chips are presented together, and the perceiver is in a position to apply comparative color concepts. And the contents of conscious experience will be something like one chip that's bluer or darker blue than the other. In the diachronic case, however, the chips are presented singly and thus don't trigger the application of comparative color concepts. So when the one chip is presented, the contents of experience are simply something like a blue chip or a chip that's bluer than the background. And when the second chip is presented, the same content appears in conscious experience, the content that there's a blue chip present, or there's a chip that's bluer than the background. So it's open to the conceptualist to think of the different modes of presentation, diachronic versus synchronic, as offering different contexts which give rise to different color appearances. Now I want to emphasize that these different appearances are different conscious appearances. The conceptualism on offer is a conceptualism about the contents of conscious states, and it may very well be the case that there are unconscious states that are non-conceptual. At this point in the talk, I want to turn to consider some objections and some replies. The first objection is one that comes from Rathman in the same paper, and the objection is something that I want to call the determinateness argument. The way the determinateness argument goes is to first characterize the kind of move that I'm here making as the view that the contents of experience, of conscious experience, are only as determinable as we have concepts for. The next part of the argument is to point out that there are two sorts of concepts that we have to bring to bear to experience, and they differ with respect to their determinateness. Now, we do have determinate concepts corresponding to the unique hues, red, blue, yellow, and green. And for the rest of the hues, we have to rely on what we can call merely determinable concepts. So reddish orange or dark bluish green, these are merely determinable concepts. So the argument points out that we've got these two kinds of concepts for conceiving of color. The determinate concepts corresponding to the unique hues, and the merely determinable concepts for dark reddish orange, etc. Next, the determinist argument, the determinateness argument, points out that there doesn't seem to be any obvious introspective difference with respect to determinateness in the way in which we perceive colors. There's no obvious introspective way in which our perception of a unique hue, like unique red, is more determinate than our perception of a dark orange. So the argument goes something like this, to sum it all up. According to the defense of conceptualism that I favor, contents are only as determinate as the concepts that we have to bear on them. But there's a distinction between concepts with respect to determinateness. Some concepts are determinate, some are merely determinable, but there's no introspective difference in our experiences with respect to determinateness. So that's the argument that I'm calling Raffman's determinateness argument. Now here's a reply to that argument. The reply goes like this. Just as the conceptualist can model differences in darkness in terms of a comparative concept darker than, so can the conceptualist model differences in determinateness in terms of an application of a comparative concept more determinate than. So if two experiences were to be different with respect to determinateness, one being more determinate than the other, then the conceptualist would want to explain that difference in terms of the application of a comparative concept concerning difference in determinateness. Now, if there is no apparent difference with respect to determinateness, then the conceptualist can explain that lack of apparent difference in terms of a failure to apply the relevant determinateness concepts. To be clear, the point I'm making here is not to assume that people are going around applying concepts of differential degrees of determinateness. That's probably a relatively rare thing for people to have a concept of, yet alone to regularly apply to their perceptual states. In fact, I'm granting that they may very well lack such a concept. The conceptualist move that I'm describing is to say that it's precisely that failure to apply such a concept that explains the failure of any apparent difference with respect to determinateness. And that's my reply to the determinateness argument. The next objection that I want to consider is an objection that bears a certain resemblance to the diachronic indiscriminability argument, but this argument puts especially heavy emphasis on certain conceivability considerations. The argument that I have in mind might go as follows. It's conceivable that there are qualia pairs that are in synchronic presentations distinguishable and in diachronic presentations not distinguishable. That is, pairs the members of which are present both in the synchronic condition and the diachronic condition. And if we make certain assumptions connecting conceivability to possibility, then the conceivability of such qualia pairs means that it's possible that there are such qualia pairs. And so it's possible that there are contents of consciousness that outstrip our conceptual contents. And so therefore, it's not necessary that conscious experience has only conceptual contents. Now, it's beyond the scope of the present talk to grapple with this conceivability argument that's modeled on the diachronic indiscriminability argument. But I do want to make this point, and that is to emphasize that what I'm interested in here is evaluating the diachronic indistinguishability argument as an empirical argument. I'm interested only in empirical evidence that there is more to conscious experience than can be conceptualized. And I'm happy to be relatively broad about what counts as empirical evidence and include introspective evidence among empirical evidence. But it seems to me that there are no compelling pieces of empirical evidence that there are such qualia pairs that outstrip our conceptual repertoires. The next objection that I want to consider is an objection that comes from people who attribute phenomenal consciousness to babies and non-human animals, but either do not attribute any concepts to these creatures, or attribute very different concepts to these creatures. For the line of objection that involves attributing no concepts to these creatures, I'd like to point out that such an objection overlooks the massive amounts of evidence that babies and non-human animals actually do have concepts. Now, I'm not going to review that evidence here. I do go into that elsewhere. What I would like to point out is the following. One worry that I have about appeals to babies and non-human animals, as they usually appear in conversations about non-conceptual content, is that they're a sort of conceivability line of thought where it's conceivable, so it's claimed, that non-humans have phenomenal consciousness like ours, that they experience colors in the way that we do, but have no concepts, or very, very different concepts than we do. And I need to emphasize again that I'm not interested here in taking on conceivability arguments. I'm interested in evaluating the empirical case against conceptualism. And if we make the shift to the focus on the empirical merit, then the objector that wants to base their case on babies and non-human animals is going to need to present empirical evidence that, number one, babies and non-human animals have phenomenal consciousness of colors the way that we do, and don't have concepts that we do. That is, they need empirical evidence for both of those claims. And I am not aware of any compelling empirical evidence that supports both of those claims. The next objection that I want to consider is an objection that tries to take on my remarks, assimilating the differences between the diachronic and the synchronic presentations of the color chips to contexts, and tries to say, well, those sorts of context differences can be controlled for. And so context effects of color perception is irrelevant. The way I'm imagining this objection going is it tries to come up with a version of the experimental condition in which there isn't a difference in color context between the synchronic and diachronic presentations. So one way of thinking of the way in which these new experiments would go would be by reference to the following pairs of stimuli presented as figures 3 and figure 4 in the accompanying paper. The stimuli presented in each distinct presentation in the diachronic discrimination case would be one of figures 3 and 4. The task put to the subject is to make a same as before yes or no judgment about colors appearing on the right side of each display. Synchronic discrimination tasks would use just one of figures 3 and 4 and ask, say of figure 3, if the left and right regions contain the same color. Such an experimental design is aimed at avoiding the accusation that the colors presented in the synchronic and diachronic contexts are colors presented in different contexts, and thus may not be assumed that there is a color appearance that is constant across contexts. In this new experiment, the color context of the right-hand color in figure 3 is arguably the same as the color context of the left-hand color in figure 4, since figures 3 and 4 are just spatial rotations of each other. Now there are two responses that I want to make concerning this attempt to control for context in the experiments connected with the diachronic indistinguishability argument. The first point I want to make is that if the experimental subject has access to certain information, like that these are the only colors that they're presented with, then it's not clear that there's going to be a failure of diachronic discriminability anymore, because then the subject would be in a position to conceive of the different color pairs as the darker one, and the subject would be in a position to say of presentations of figure 3 and figure 4 that in the one case the darker one is on the right and on the left in the other case. So my first point is that under certain conditions, this attempt to control for context is going to remove the failure of diachronic discrimination. The second point that I want to make is that even in conditions in which there is a failure of diachronic discrimination, that is predicted by the kind of conceptualist model that I have on offer. The colors in question that are straddling a memory delay are not in a position to trigger the relevant comparative color concepts. So the perceiver is just going to be neutral with respect to the question, is this earlier chip darker than or lighter than this later chip? They are not present to trigger the appropriate comparative color concepts. I turn now to the concluding section of my talk. In this section, I want to review the main explanatory strategies that are available to the kind of conceptualism that I favor. Now, the three kinds of cases that the conceptualist needs to explain in connection with all this stuff about diachronic discriminability are the following. First, there needs to be an explanation of the successful diachronic discrimination of basic hues. Second, there needs to be an explanation of the successful synchronic discrimination of very similar shades. And finally, there has to be an explanation of the failure of diachronic discrimination of very similar shades. Now I want to make my presentation of these three explanations by consulting the following functional analysis. The main components of this functional analysis will be a conscious experience which has conceptual content only, and a short-term memory buffer, which also has only conceptual content. These are the two main components of this functional analysis. Other components involve non-conscious elements, such as a non-conscious sensory impression and a non-conscious store of concepts that the impression interacts with to trigger the appropriate concepts in conscious experience. Conceptual contents which can be passed on from conscious experience to a short-term memory buffer. Now, these two main aspects of the functional analysis, the conscious experience and the short-term memory buffer, are the basis for the appropriate comparisons that would give rise to successful judgments of distinctness of the two different paint chips. And in cases in which the judgment is that there is no difference, or there's a failure to make a judgment of difference, this is primarily explained in terms of the contents of the conscious experience and the short-term memory buffer. So let's take a look at this functional analysis spelled out in terms of the following figure. So let's talk about the successful diachronic discrimination of blue and red. So first, at time t1, blue paint chip is presented. This gives rise to a non-conscious sensory impression of phenomenal blueness, say. That triggers access of a non-conscious store of concepts, which dumps into conscious experience the appropriate conceptual contents. Contents like that there's a blue chip present, or a chip bluer than the background. Now, this content can be passed at time t2 to a short-term memory buffer where it's held during the presentation of the red paint chip and the subsequent red sensory impression, triggering the application of the relevant conceptual contents in conscious experience, like that there's a red chip present. And then the conceptual contents in conscious experience and short-term memory can give rise to appropriate judgment, the judgment that there are two different colors. In the case of the successful synchronic discrimination of very close shades, we can think of this as starting with the presentation of the two paint chips, and they give rise to two corresponding sensory impressions, and these access the relevant concepts which get dumped into conscious experience, and here we've got an opportunity to apply the relative comparative concepts. So the contents of conscious experience would be something like two blues, one darker than the other, and there is really no need in this case for any serious involvement from short-term memory. The conceptual content of the conscious experience is sufficient to give rise to the judgment of there being two different colors. Finally, we turn to the explanation of the failure to discriminate very close shades diachronically. And here the key aspect of the explanation is to focus on at time t2 what the contents are of conscious experience and the short-term memory buffer. The short-term memory buffer has a content based on the presentation of the first chip at paint 1, and that content is simply something like one blue chip or a chip bluer than the background. And the current conscious experience has a content which is one blue chip, a chip bluer than the background. And these contents are insufficient to render a judgment of discriminateness. So that brings me to the end of my talk, and I would like to thank some people. I would like to thank you, the viewer, if you've made it to the end of my talk. I'd also like to thank Richard Brown for organizing this online conference. I think he's done a terrific job. I'd also like to thank my commenters, Philippe Chouard, Charlie Pelling, David Paraplochik, and Jake Berger. I haven't seen their comments yet, but I'm looking forward to them, and I thank them in advance for destroying me, I'm sure. Ladies and gentlemen, this has been Pete Mandic. Good night, or good morning.